Our next subject will be dealing with something that Dreamweaver calls fluid grid layouts. Now, fluid grid layouts are referring to a subject known as responsive design. And responsive design is made possible through the use of CSS3 and something called media queries. In order to better understand what this actually means, let's take a look in a browser. And here you'll see inside of our browser the same layout that we've been working with up to this point, but the main difference between this one and the previous versions is that the previous version was a fixed pixel design. This version, however, works with percentages, and percentage amounts determine how much space your design is going to take up inside of any particular browser that you're viewing it. So let's take a look. If we were to view this on a desktop, you might see something that looks along these lines. Notice what happens when we start to squeeze this browser down. Not only is the text moving around, but some of the images are actually starting to change size as well. What this is referring to is the size of the browser on a desktop, or perhaps when you are viewing this inside of something like an iPad or another tablet, you'll notice that the three columns we had at the bottom inside of our footer are now represented as 1 and then 2. And if we were to squeeze this down even further so that we only end up with one column, this is representing what your website might look like if it was viewed on a phone. So these are the things that we're going to be exploring in this particular chapter. So responsive design, working with media queries inside of Dreamweaver using their new fluid grid layouts. So to get started, let's take a look in your site folder in Dreamweaver. And you can see here that I've defined a site as Chapter 11, and I've pointed to the source files inside of the Chapter 11 folder. Within that folder, you'll notice that I have a finished file that you can open up and take a look at. As well, I've got a start file that is missing a few elements, but has some of the assets that we'll need to make this work. So begin this chapter by creating the site. Once that's done, let's start by creating a new fluid grid layout, and you'll find that under the File menu under New Fluid Grid Layout. Once you click on that, you'll be confronted with a new document window for the fluid grid layout. And here you'll be recognizing that there are three different types of environments that we are going to be targeting. Number one, we're specifically going to be addressing what's happening in a desktop layout, tablet layout, as well as a mobile layout. Within these environments, I would like you to take note that the design that we are going to be creating will be divided into a number of columns, and you'll see them represented here. I'm going to leave the values in the desktop for 12 columns, tablet 8 columns, and mobile for 5 columns. Here you'll also notice that the amount of space that's going to be taken up is going to be dealt with in a percentage amount rather than the fixed pixel amount that we've been using in the past. What this means is, no matter how big the browser window actually will be, our website will only ever take up 90% of the available space. So there's always going to be a little bit of space on either sides of this particular website. Same thing here on the tablet. It's taking up, as a default, 93%, and on the mobile, it's taking up 91%. Now you'll notice, as a default, it usually says 15% of column width. I'm actually creating 20% of space in between the individual column widths. At this point, what I'd like you to do is just create a new file. So, where to put this? First of all, it's asking, where would you like to have the CSS for this particular file located? So I'd like you to go to the Start menu and locate the CSS file here. You'll notice there's one already there called theme.css, which I've prepared for you. The one that we are creating, on the other hand, though, we'll call layout. Once we have our layout saved, we're now going to be confronted with a new type of window. And you'll see here that this particular window is already showing us a very small view of what your website might look like. This is the mobile view. Notice down here at the bottom there are different sizes that we can target. Right now we are looking at the mobile size. This is the tablet size, and here is the desktop size. Within this environment, there are a number of things that we can see. First of all, if you'll notice, there happens to be these columns and these yellow markers here. These are under the View menu as visual aids, and you'll notice that within the visual aids there is Fluid Grid Layout Guides. You can hide these if you find them a little bit disturbing, but at the very beginning, when we're laying out our basis of our design, it's probably a good thing to have these things visible. And this particular fluid grid layout is made to be worked within the design view, so I'm just going to leave it the way it is. Now, one of the things that we can do is to remove the information that's inside here. I'm just going to switch to the code view for a second. And what I want you to see is that there is a div inside here called layout div number 1. I'm going to ask you to remove that entire div, and all we're left with is div class grid container, and it has a clearfix. So it's got two classes associated with it. That's what we want, and everything else we are going to implement ourselves. Before we move on, you can see that there's some script information here that doesn't look very good until we file save the information. Let's save this in the start file, and we're just going to name it index.html. Now that we've got the index page saved, you'll notice that a new window pops open that says copy dependent files. This design requires the following dependent files: boilerplate.css and respond.min.js. These two supporting files are what we're going to need to make this work. Boilerplate.css has all of the information that will contain the very basics of making this particular file work in a CSS environment. It also takes care of things like HTML5 compatibility and other issues. You can actually search for boilerplate.css online and it'll give you even more information. However, feel free to look at your boilerplate.css, as we will be doing soon enough. The respond.min.js file is a JavaScript file that has been minified so that it's a lot lighter to load, and this one is going to help us with the responsive design. It's also asking you where to copy these files, and you'll notice that in my case I'm just copying them to the Chapter 11 start folder. So we'll copy them there. Once there, you'll notice that your script tag is now pointing to respond.min.js. As well, you'll see that there are a number of CSS files located right here. If we look inside of our folder, you can see that within the start file, you now have a boilerplate CSS and a respond.min.js file. Now you can leave them right there if you wish. However, you can also create other folders to accommodate these files and move them within there. Notice this: if you're going to be moving anything around, I strongly suggest that you do it within the Files menu, because if I wanted my boilerplate CSS within my CSS folder, notice what happens. If I take it and move it there, it's going to ask me to update the files, and I will say yes, of course, update those files. Now you'll see that it still will work because Dreamweaver has written _CSS prior to the boilerplate CSS file. Let's do the same thing for our JS file. However, I'm going to right-click on the Start menu, say New Folder, and I'll choose _scripts. Then I'll move the respond.js file into it. Once I'm asked if I want to update the files, I will of course say yes, update those files. And you'll notice that now in the code view, the script tag is now showing go to the scripts folder, then find me respond.min.js. So that's just something that you might want to be doing in order to keep things nice and neat inside of your own folders. At this point, if we look in the design view, well, I've removed the elements that were there to begin with, but now what we're going to be doing is populating that particular folder that we've created here, the div with the grid container and ClearFix classes applied to it, and we're going to be putting a number of divs inside of that. Come back in the next video and I'll show you how to do just that.